I'll tell you a story about a guy who grew up in a small town where dreams faded under the weight of necessity. He loved fixing things and wanted to become an engineer, but life cornered him into a factory job, trapping him in a hopeless routine. Hi everyone, welcome to Life Unveiled. Let's get started. Jason was walking home from a night shift in mid-January. The frost bit into his bones and stung his face, the wind howling through the empty streets like a lost wolf. He trudged along the roadside in an old jacket with worn-out elbows and a hole in the pocket he kept meaning to sew, but never got around to. The town slept under a thick blanket of snow, with only dim streetlights flickering along the road, casting long shadows across the white expanse. Suddenly, a faint whimper broke through the wind's wail, barely audible, coming from a snowdrift by the roadside. Jason stopped, frowned, rubbed his frozen hands together and listened, wondering if he'd imagined it. The sound came again, thin, pitiful, almost human, like something small crying for help. He stepped closer, crouched down, and saw a puppy, a tiny bundle of matted fur, trembling from the cold, eyes still closed, as if it had already given up on life and this world. He could have kept walking. His legs ached after 12 hours at the factory, where he'd spent the day hauling heavy crates along the conveyor belt. All he could think about was the cold ham sandwich waiting in his fridge and his sagging bed with its creaky mattress. But something stirred inside him, maybe pity for this helpless creature, or a memory of himself, freezing in the grey monotony of a life where every day mirrored the last. Jason shrugged off his jacket, shook off the snow, wrapped the puppy gently in its warm lining, and carried it home, cradling it against his chest to share what little heat he had. In his cramped apartment on the edge of town, where the air smelled of dampness and old furniture, he spent hours warming the pup by the heater, making a nest from an old sweater that had been gathering dust in the closet. The puppy was frail, barely breathing, and Jason feared he might not save it. Still, he didn't give up. He dug out a dropper from a drawer, warmed some milk on the stove, and patiently fed it, drop by drop, until the little thing began to stir weakly. A few days later, the puppy opened its eyes, big, dark, and full of a childlike trust, and soon it was clumsily scampering after him across the creaky floor, wagging a tail that seemed too long for its tiny body. Jason named it Luke, for no particular reason. The name just popped into his head as he watched his new companion settle into the apartment. Luke became the spark that ignited something in Jason's dull days. First, he noticed his elderly neighbour, Mrs. Clark, struggling daily with heavy grocery bags from the store down the street. Her back bent under the weight, her hands trembled, and her face showed a weariness she tried to hide behind a faint smile. One evening, as she paused to catch her breath, Jason silently approached, took her bags of potatoes and canned goods, and carried them to her faded green door. Mrs. Clark frowned at first, unaccustomed to help, but then smiled and said softly, "Thank you, son. God bless you." A week later, he saw her kitchen faucet leaking, a puddle forming on the floor from months of neglect. She couldn't afford a repairman on her meagre pension. Jason brought his toolbox, a rusty collection of nuts and screwdrivers, and fixed it in an hour, leaving her kitchen dry and tidy. Then he noticed the kids playing in the snow without warm coats, the wind cutting through them as their laughter mixed with coughs. Recalling the skills he'd once prided himself on as a kid, he scavenged some dusty boards from the basement and built a simple bench so they'd have a place to sit and warm up between games. He also saw how his mother slouched after long shifts at the shop, her exhaustion growing daily, her back pain hidden behind a habitual, "I'm fine." He started covering her weekends at the counter, standing among shelves of cereal and cans so she could rest at home with a cup of tea and the old TV. But the real turning point came at the factory, where he'd worked for over a decade. One morning, an old milling machine, a rusty beast that hummed so loudly it hurt your ears, started smoking and ground to a halt with a final groan. Management shrugged it off, deciding it was easier to scrap it than fix it. Jason stared at the heap of greasy metal and felt a thrill, the same excitement he'd known as a kid tinkering with his grandfather's broken radio. He volunteered to repair it, though no one thought he'd succeed. After shifts, when everyone else went home, He stayed in the workshop alone, dismantling gears, cleaning parts, poring over schematics on an ancient computer with a flickering screen. His hands turned black with oil, his eyes watered from fatigue and the dim lamp's light. But after a week of late nights in the cold shop, the machine roared back to life, as if awakened from a long sleep. His co-workers exchanged surprised glances. Some clapped him on the back, and the boss, Bob, a stern man with grey temples and a commanding voice, approached, slapped his shoulder and said, "What are you, some self-taught engineer? Go study, kid, while you still can. A brain like that's gonna waste." Those words lodged in his mind like a splinter, refusing to let go. Jason came home, sat at his wobbly kitchen table with Luke curling up at his feet, resting a warm muzzle on his boot. He looked at the dog, at its calm eyes, and thought, 30 years old, no money, no time. School's a ticket to nowhere, a waste of effort. But Luke nudged his hand with a cold nose, licked his fingers as if saying, "You pulled me out of that snowdrift. Pull yourself out of this pit." The next day, Jason grabbed an old backpack, walked to the local technical college, and enrolled in evening classes, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. By day, he worked at the factory, hauling crates or inspecting parts. By night, he pored over textbooks, scribbling formulas under a cheap lamp's glow. Sleep became a rare visitor, sneaking in for a couple of hours before dawn, but he pressed on. The first months were hell. Equations jumbled in his head. Instructors seemed harsher than factory foremen, and money barely stretched to cover food, rent, and books. One night, he nearly quit, flung his notebook against the wall, yelling into the empty room, "Why am I even doing this?" Pages scattered, but Luke patted over, licked his hand, and lay beside him, as if reminding him why he'd started. Ashamed, Jason picked up the sheets, sat back down, and kept going. 2 years later, he held a technician's diploma, its thin cover smelling of paper and feeling heavier than all the crates he'd ever lifted. It was a first step, but he wanted more, needed to prove he could climb higher. At the factory, people whispered behind his back, "Jason got educated, so what? He'll stay here like the rest of us." He heard them, clenched his jaw, and applied to a university's part-time program. Now, alongside work and courses, he travelled to the next town for exams, cramming in run-down lecture halls. Sometimes he'd stumble home at 3 a.m, collapsing onto the couch, fully clothed, with Luke curling up beside him, a warm, loyal guardian. There were moments when everything hung by a thread. He once failed a mechanics exam, and the professor, a dry old man in glasses, remarked, "Maybe this isn't for you, kid." Jason stared at the floor in silence. But at home, he cracked open the book, studied until dawn with letters dancing before his eyes, and aced the retake, proving he wouldn't back down. Life began to shift, slow and steady, like a river wearing down stone. At the factory, they moved him to the repair department, where he relied less on brute strength and more on his mind, deciphering blueprints and mechanisms. He started side gigs, fixing neighbours' sputtering toasters, stubborn lawnmowers, even an old tractor a farmer was ready to scrap. Money trickled in, and one day he decided to fix up his apartment, painted the walls light grey, replaced the leaky sink that had nagged at him, built shelves for his growing stack of books and manuals. Luke claimed a sunny spot by the window, dozing there while Jason sketched designs late into the night. By 40, Jason was an engineer. Still at the same factory where he'd started with crates, but now he sat at a desk with blueprints, designing machines that hummed in the workshops, filling the air with a familiar sound. Each rumble brought a quiet, deep pride. His apartment gleamed with cleanliness, smelling of fresh paint and coffee, and his mother no longer slouched so much he'd convinced her to quit the shop, helping her with money for warm clothes and medicine. Luke, now a grown dog with greying fur and a slower gait, slept at his feet as Jason drafted his latest project, pencil gliding over paper. Sometimes he'd gaze out the window at the snow-covered town, at those same flickering streetlights, and wonder, what if I'd walked past that snowdrift? There were losses along the way. Friends he had once shared beers with at sticky bar tables drifted away, puzzled by his showing off with studies and drawings. At the factory, some eyed him with envy or mocked him as a try-hard behind his back. But new people entered his life. On the courses, he befriended Tom, a gruff ex-soldier with kind eyes who also craved knowledge. At university, he met Professor Green, a sharp-witted old man who explained complex ideas simply and became his mentor. These connections fueled him when he felt like giving up. One day, Mrs. Clark invited him for tea in her little home, fragrant with cinnamon and old books, where worn novels lined the shelves and an embroidered cloth graced the table. She set a steaming mug before him and said, "You know, Jason, I watched you sinking in this life like a bog was pulling you under. Now you're swimming, and swimming well." He ducked his head, embarrassed, staring into his tea. But her words held a truth he couldn't voice himself. That puppy in the snow hadn't been a mere chance encounter. It was a mirror, reflecting a Jason who was freezing yet alive, still able to fight. The years passed quietly, relentlessly. Luke grew old, moving stiffly, sometimes limping, but he still greeted Jason at the door, tail wagging. Jason took him on walks to the river outside town, where the water flowed slowly, mirroring the grey sky. They'd sit on an old log by the bank, watching the current, and he'd think about how far he'd come since that winter night, when everything could have ended differently. He didn't become a millionaire or build skyscrapers or bridges like he'd dreamed as a kid, but he built himself, step by stubborn step, out of grit, faith, and a refusal to let himself drown. Jason's story is a lesson. Life doesn't change on its own or hand you gifts on a platter. It waits for you to spot a chance and take a step, even a small one, like saving a puppy from a snowdrift on a frigid night. Luke didn't just pull Jason from the snow. He pulled him from the shadows where he had lived for years, blind to the light. We can all stay stuck in routine, afraid to risk losing the little we have or fearing the unknown, but take that chance, and a path opens up, just as it did for him. The key is not to walk past yourself, not to miss that moment when you can start anew.
If you enjoyed this story, drop a like and subscribe for more tales like this. Hit the bell, and we'll catch you in the next one.